Ready to start. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Brewerton-Palmer. I'm a lawyer at the law firm Caplan Cobb, and I'm on the board of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. I'd like to welcome you today to Law Enforcement and the First Amendment, which is a program we're putting on in conjunction with the Weltner event, our annual benefit that's happening next week. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm very excited to facilitate this discussion with our great panelists today. We can't go on without thanking our sponsors. The foundation could not put on programming like this without them. So thank you so much to them. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Vic Reynolds is the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a position that he's served in since February of 2019. Before that, Vic was twice elected as the district attorney of Cobb County, and he's also served as a police officer, as the chief magistrate judge of Cobb County, and as a partner at the law firm Berry and Reynolds. Zoe Bambara is a community organizer and activist here in Atlanta. She's organized events both here and in Louisville, Kentucky to protest the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. Zoe works with a number of civil rights organizations around Atlanta, including the We're Tired movement, Until Freedom, and RISE. And she is currently a freshman at Morris Brown, which is an HBCU here in Atlanta. Clare Norins is the director of the First Amendment Clinic at UGA's School of Law, helping to get that off the ground in its first year of operation. Before joining UGA, Clare worked in the New York Attorney General's Office Civil Rights Bureau and has many years of experience litigating civil rights, both as a private and a public attorney. Gerry Weber is a civil rights attorney here in Atlanta. He has his own firm focused on civil rights, and before that, he was the legal director of the ACLU of Georgia for 17 years. Gerry, like Clare and I, is also on the board of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. Today's program is going to focus on the intersection of First Amendment rights and law enforcement, with a particular focus on a citizen's right to record the police, what you can and can't do in those situations, what to expect, as well as some practical tips if you find yourself in a situation involving police activity and a protest situation. So just so everybody knows, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of this program. So if you have any questions as we go, please feel free to pop those in the chat and we will address them at the end, or you can hold them and do the chat when we get to the Q&A section. To start things off, we're going to show you some examples of citizen filmed videos of police to give you an idea of the potential power and value of these recordings, as well as to provide some opportunities for us to talk about those instances. After those videos, Gerry is going to outline some of the rules for recording police here in Georgia, and then we'll move on with our discussion.
Great. Welcome, everyone. And the first of these videos that we're going to watch, and I will warn people that some of these are disturbing, is the shooting of Walter Scott in 2015 in North Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Scott was chased, shot, and ultimately killed for failure to pay child support, or alleged failure to pay child support. This is You will see after the officer shoots and kills Mr. Scott, he will return backwards and ultimately drop a weapon that he will later claim was Mr. Scott's. We will see that the difference between the officer remaining on the force and the officer facing murder charges and the family ultimately having a settlement for $6.8 million for the death of Mr. Scott really is the video. And we thought that this would be the first video for us to watch because it really illustrates the very, very powerful impact of these videos in telling what actually happened and not necessarily what an officer may claim happened. And we will see the officer shortly, I believe, if it's not already happened, having dropped the weapon. Here we go. All right. And the second of these videos will involve the police beating of Roderick Walker. Mr. Walker you will see his wife and you will see his child in the area. You will see his wife filming, and part of the reason we're watching this happened in Clayton County, Georgia very recently in the last couple of months, is to see what we're going to be talking about the need to not interfere with the officer when you are filming. And this really illustrates it. Even though Mrs. Walker was very, very upset at this time, she did not interfere with the officer's arrest.
Hey, get the fuck up off of him! Get the fuck up off of him!
There's a third party also filming.
Hey, you cocksucking pig, get the fuck up off of him!
And the third of these videos that we'll see involves Sharif Hassan, who is a freelance photographer who was at the Black Lives Matter protests in Atlanta. You will see him come on to the scene, filming an arrest. You will see someone else filming him, filming when he becomes arrested. And at the end of the story,
We got somebody arrested right here. They're grabbing people.
and the individual you're talking will herself be arrested as well. So we wanted to have you watch those videos to really put this issue in context. And I'm the first speaker, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the First Amendment right to film. If you could turn to the next slide, the first case in Georgia and the first case in the 11th Circuit, which includes Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, was decided in 1988. It was a WSB TV Channel 2 reporter who was investigating an allegation that a Douglas County Sheriff, Earl Lee, was using inmates to build a barn on his own property. And Sheriff Earl Lee didn't like it and knocked the cameraman and the camera down to the ground, and a lawsuit was filed. And the 11th Circuit recognized the First Amendment right of reporters and cameramen to film. In the wake of that ruling, and over all of the time since 1988, the 11th Circuit has repeatedly recognized that there's a right to film in a variety of different contexts for both citizen journalists and citizens. Really, the 11th Circuit was one of the first circuits in the country to recognize this right. At this point, really all of the other circuits that have addressed the question have agreed across the country that there's a First Amendment right to film. The issue hasn't been decided by the Supreme Court, but we don't anticipate that there will be any disagreement from the Supreme Court, especially given the variety of circuits that have accepted this proposition of the law. And here are some recent cases in Georgia on the right to film. Some of them involve citizens, some of them involve citizen journalists, and some of them involve reporters. And as you'll see, most of these cases involved arrests, but some of them didn't. And as you'll see, most of the cases settled, with one exception that I'm happy to discuss later in our discussion. And several of the settlements in these lawsuits led to new policies for police departments. And here is the revision to the Atlanta Police Department's standard operating procedure on the citizen right to film that was part of our settlement, and emphasizes a few things. First, that police officers cannot physically interfere with the performance. Police officers cannot arrest someone as long as that person is not physically interfering with the performance of a police officer while they're filming, that the officer violates both the Constitution and federal law to delete or destroy an image that is on someone's film. And if they do that, as part of the settlement in that case, the officer will face dismissal, either if they delete images or if they arrest someone who is not physically interfering with the performance of the officer's duty when they are filming. And so here's the basic limits on the right to film that we'll be discussing later. First, you can't interfere with the officer physically. You can't actually get between and touch the officer. The second issue is getting within the arrest periphery of the officer. You can't stand between the officer and the citizen about to be arrested. The exact kind of parameters of how far away you must be are really kind of an open question, and we saw that in the second video. And then the third issue, and it may play out in the third video that we watched, is the person who is filming can still be arrested if they violated some other law. And both of the citizens who were filming in that case were arrested for a violation of a City of Atlanta curfew that was in place. And the officer will often ask you to do many things, and this is kind of a list of some of the things that the officer may ask you, and you don't have the obligation to answer certain questions or do certain things. First is, unless you're being arrested, you need not give your identity to the officer. You need not, and this was recently decided in one of the cases I litigated, tell the officer why you are filming. Third, you need not stop filming unless, of course, you're interfering with the officer's actions in arresting someone. Fourth, and this has happened in a lot of cases, even if the officer demands it, you have no obligation to delete images that are on your video, and they may try to do that. Fifth is that the officer may ask you to move back. If you are close to the officer while the officer is engaged in an arrest and you don't want to be arrested, it may make sense to move back somewhat. But if you're outside of the officer's general periphery and the arrestee's general periphery and you're filming, the officer can't tell you to move 2 blocks away, for example. The officer may ask you to give them your camera. If you're not under arrest, you have no obligation to give them your camera. And last, you need not give the officer the passcode to your camera, and it's often advisable to have your camera, if you're going to an event like a Black Lives Matter event, to not have your camera set up for triggering on your image. So the officer can't hold up the camera to you and get into your camera. That will be developed as we through this issue with all of the panelists and with you.
Thanks, Gerry. So Gerry's presentation focused on recordings from a citizen's point of view. So I'd like to turn to you, Director Reynolds, and ask about the law enforcement perspective on videos of police activity. We know the law here in Georgia protects a citizen's right to record, and police agencies around the state are now requiring officers to use body cameras that provide their own recordings of officer activities. So in your view, what value do these types of video recordings have, whether for law enforcement or for society more generally?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me. Certainly from a GBI perspective, the citizen's right to film an officer's body cam, all of those lend itself to what the GBI does day in and day out. Gerry pointed out a moment ago, and that's to seek the truth. And we need to know, we need to see what happens at a scene in order for, particularly for our agency, to do what we do. We're what's called a requesting or assisting agency. So we're literally coming in to make some determination of what happened here. Did someone commit a criminal act? Did an officer do something that he or she shouldn't have? And so for us to know the entire process, the entire scene, to find the truth, then these videos serve a tremendous purpose for that. They're often an extremely important piece or part of the puzzle that we begin putting together in our agency to find out what happened, say, for example, in an officer-involved shooting. It's also important, and I know we'll touch on it a little bit later, for us when we can, and if we can, to make sure that we share that with the public and the public sees that. There's some limitations on it, and we'll address it, I know, later on this afternoon. But, you know, at this agency, we're a firm believer that people certainly have that right. We know they have that right. We expect them to video. We also hopefully can use those videos, and we have before, to put cases together. You know, this thing called law enforcement works the best when it's built on a foundation of some kind of trust between the agencies that are enforcing the law and the citizenry that they're trying to protect and serve. And in all candor, law enforcement hasn't done a good job of that in developing that trust, or at least fostering it. And so these videos tend to help in those circumstances. And I will tell you this, ironically, from a little bit deeper dive into that, I happened to be somewhere Wednesday of this week speaking, and a ranking officer of a department, one of the 5 metro counties, came up to me, and we were chatting about his department. And he said, you know, Director, the best thing that's happened to us the last 15 years is body cams. He said it just helps us so much, because the overwhelming majority of time, it corroborates what an officer says happened. He gave an example of internal affairs investigations that were frequently over literally before they start, once the body cam video was observed. As Gerry pointed out, the examples he gave earlier did just the opposite. It showed where something happened that shouldn't have, and thankfully the truth was discovered in those cases. And so I think, to answer your question with a broad brush, you know, as far as our agency is certainly concerned, and I hope I would speak in this day and time for the majority of law enforcement, the citizens' right to film. The body cams that officers wear do one thing, and that lends itself to the truth. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish and find, is the truth.
Great. Yeah, you're right that we will come back to some of the nitty-gritty of disclosure and things later. But first, Claire, I'd like to switch perspectives again and consider things from the lens of the public who is viewing these videos on social media or on the news. So can you walk us through what the First Amendment has to say about the public's right to see these videos and receive that content?
Claire, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry. So hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. So the right to record is really essential to holding all public officials accountable, and today we're focusing on the police. And if we could go to the next slide, please. As Sarah mentioned, there is a parallel First Amendment right of the public to receive the information that is captured in photography and video. So up to now, the panelists have mostly spoken about the rights of the person doing the recording, to record and then to share that recording with others. And the Supreme Court has long recognized that the folks on the receiving end also have a reciprocal First Amendment right, because in order for our self-governing democracy to work, the public needs to have information about what its government and what its public officials are doing. So I think now more than ever, this is very important, because in the age of a pandemic, folks who might otherwise be out observing things for themselves may choose to stay home and are relying on the eyes and ears of the journalists and citizen journalists and bystanders who record and share what they've observed. So this is really an issue that is live here in Georgia, but all over the country. And so if we could go to the next slide. This year alone, there's really been a proliferation of lawsuits around the country. I've just compiled a few of them really here. But these are both class action lawsuits, which seek to represent groups of people, as well as single plaintiff lawsuits. And we see that both journalists and legal observers and bystanders who are in a neutral role are at the heart of these lawsuits, which seek to protect people's ability to bear witness and record where police activity is involved. And if we can go on to the next slide, a couple more of these cases. And I want to just stop for a minute on the Index newspapers case, because there was a very broad injunction granted by a federal judge in Oregon that went so far as to say that journalists and legal observers did not have to comply with orders to disperse that were given by the police, so long as they were not blocking or impeding the police. And that was really a novel kind of protection given to these neutral observers. It was so novel, in fact, that the Ninth Circuit has now stayed that injunction, meaning that it cannot be enforced while the Ninth Circuit decides on appeal whether the injunction is lawful. So there we saw a judge really going above and beyond to protect the right to observe and record, and the Ninth Circuit was not comfortable with that. So I just wanted to share some tips, some practical tips in terms of when you are out, either just observing, taking notes, or if you are recording. So if you're a member of the press, it's important in most cases to visibly identify yourself as such. The only caveat to that would be if you're at an event where the participants might be antagonistic towards members of the press, but also carrying business cards, even if you don't want to identify yourself upon sight as a journalist. You may be well served by having a business card that identifies you that way if you are stopped by the police. So as the law currently stands, you do have to comply with an order to disperse, even if you're not participating in the demonstration or event. And even if you think the dispersal order is unlawful, it's still advisable for you to disperse as directed, unless you specifically receive permission from the police to remain in a place where you are not blocking or impeding. It's important to document. So even if you're being asked to stop filming, or if you are being placed under arrest, it's important to try to keep filming and take notes right afterwards if you can't keep filming. Have witnesses that you can go back to later to, provide accounts of what occurred, or maybe the witnesses are able to photograph or film. Because that's all very important when it comes to challenging the event after the fact. You want to be careful not to show voluntarily your notes or your film or your photos. The reason for this is that if you voluntarily consent to show some of what you've gathered, it can be construed as consent for law enforcement to see everything that you've collected. And as Gerry mentioned, it's better to use a passcode than some sort of facial recognition or thumbprint to lock your phone or your camera, so that you can prevent involuntarily unlocking your phone or camera. If you are searched, especially if it's not pursuant to an arrest, it's important to be clear that you are not consenting by verbally stating, "I'm not consenting." And even if you are arrested, the police usually need to have a warrant to search your phone. There are some exceptions for exigent emergency circumstances, but the general rule is that even if you're arrested, to look through your phone, the police will need to get a warrant. And finally, if you are arrested, it's important not to resist. That really can only make the situation worse, lead to more severe charges against you. So do not resist, even if you believe you're being wrongfully arrested. And as soon as you can, contact your editor if you are working for an organization or publication that has an editor, or contact your lawyer, or if all else fails, contact the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which has a legal defense hotline, which is on the screen.
Thanks so much, Claire. Zoe, I'd like to bring you into the discussion at this point. So we've heard about some of the different ground rules for police recordings. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the ground exercising your First Amendment rights at a protest where police are present, and what sort of interactions have you had with police in your work?
Allergies, so I sound a little weird. But it honestly really depends on the amount of people that are there and the amount of people who are filming. I've been in protesting in Atlanta and in Louisville, Kentucky. So when people are, have their camera phones, they're recording, certain officers change their demeanor. But for example, I was protesting in Atlanta a couple weeks ago. Actually, I got tear gassed at that one, and I wasn't recording, and certain police officers were like laughing at me and smiling and like kind of trying to be funny in a way, I guess. And as soon as somebody starts recording, the whole demeanor switches. So that's why I think recording the police is very important, because it kind of keeps them in check in a way. So yeah.
So it seems to me, I think publicly, as we watch sort of some of these high-profile incidents unfold, I have seen a pattern of video impacting the way that the public digest these stories. And you can see there was an extraordinary amount of video evidence of the killing of George Floyd, whereas there is none for Breonna Taylor. And I think that the trajectory of the public awareness of those cases is very different. And those are just two anecdotes, but it seems to me that there is a use for video to make events easier for people to understand, more likely to gain public attention. And I was wondering if you had seen that in your work. Does having video of an incident, has that impacted the way that you organize around particular events, or the way that you need to educate people about them? Do people seem more impacted by things with video? What's your experience in that area?
Well, when it comes to, I guess, recordings like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or just Walter Scott, like things that we've seen, the public, it does outrage the public. Of course, me being a Black woman, I witness this stuff every day. Seeing Black trauma on like Instagram, the news, it's not fun for me. I don't like seeing it. I don't watch it because I'm living it. But I know that these videos, people who may not be in my community are now seeing it firsthand. Like, wow, this stuff actually happens. I think it does kind of light a fire under people to get out and organize and to protest like this stuff isn't right. So I'm really thankful that videos, that people are recording incidents and things like that. And yeah, it is sad because you like you said with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor happened in March, actually like 2 weeks after my birthday. And, now we're still trying to discover the truth. And of course, they said there was no body cam footage, but body cam footage is now being released. And, there was no recording of the incident. So a lot of people are really iffy on that case. But when it comes to George Floyd, which was recorded the entire time, people, were outraged and things like that. So it is recording incidents, I think, is very important for people to see from the citizens' perspective. Yeah, because, you need to see it from our side as well, because at the end of the day, we are all human. So, yeah, just to see it from our perspective.
Thank you so much. Director Reynolds, on a more practical note, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of how police recorded video is accessible to the public right now in Georgia. I know your officers don't use body cams because you're a secondary assisting agency, but you are involved in a lot of cases around the state involving other agencies with recorded video footage. So I was hoping you could kind of talk through statewide what you have seen in trends of these things being released in cases, whether controversial cases, high profile ones, or the more run-of-the-mill type cases.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. If we had our way of the GBI, when we got our hands on videos, and particularly on-scene videos that showed what happened in my world, I would push it out immediately. The reality is, you know, we're governed, dictated by open records laws. And you know, when folks file open records requests saying we'd like, you know, videos, body cams, things of that nature, the reality is, you know, that's exempt from disclosure if there's a pending investigation or a pending prosecution. What we do 99% of the time is either in one of those two stages, a pending investigation or a pending prosecution. And so frequently what will happen, and I think, and I certainly understand how frustrating it is to the public, to my friends in the media, as I shared with some of you, I haven't shared with your viewers today, but you know, my mother was in the newspaper business 42 years, so I was raised in that environment where, you know, it's best to push things out and to be public with it. And so I know, I can just imagine how frustrating it is, you know, for the media, for the public to say, you know, why can't we see that? You've seen it. Why can't we see it? And as I tell my, you know, fellow law enforcement executives, particularly, and who are chiefs or sheriffs of what I call the first responder group, the group that probably is most affected by these type of requests or these type of circumstances, is that from a personal point of view, even though it may be exempt under the Open Records Act, and it may not be, you may not have to push it out or give it to the public or give it to the requestor until the case is disposed of, I preach to them that the overwhelming majority of the time it needs to be pushed out, it needs to be seen, even if it's like the examples that were given at the first of this seminar, and they make law enforcement look bad. They still show what happened. They show the truth. And the overwhelming majority, regardless of whether or not, you know, we want to believe it or whether or not, you know, we don't see it, the overwhelming majority of interactions day in and day out that first responder type folks do are done appropriately and they're done properly. And so I tell my fellow folks in law enforcement that, you know, we need to push these things out. let me give you a real example of it. Very frequently, when we get called to officer-involved shootings and we get the information fed up the chain of command, and it comes to me and they say, you know, Director, there's a video that it's literally spot on. It shows exactly what happened. It shows the shooting, whether or not it was justified or unjustified, it shows it. It's not unusual for me personally, and certainly this agency, but for me personally to reach out to that particular agency and say, look, you know, this thing, we need to get this thing out. We right now, we need to push it out. And so even though, you know, we may not get to, because frequently either the respective agency that we are doing the investigation for, or frequently the local prosecutor whose case that will end up, whose desk that case will end up on, will say, you know, Vic, don't do that. We don't want that out yet. And so we went round and round a couple of times, and I've expressed to them that, look, it needs to get out. It needs to be seen, because when I stand in front of the media and I say, we have a video, this is what it shows. The truth is that you may not believe that until you see that video. And so I tell my friends in law enforcement that, you know, when we can, and there's sometimes we might not be able to, but when we can, we need to push that out, even though legally we may be appropriate, or we may be covered under Open Records Act by not disclosing it at this purpose or this point of a case. And so I really believe that the more we can do that, the more we can get out, the better off we are. But circling back, and I apologize, I went around the block to answer your question. The truth is that if you ask for it, if a citizen asks for it, if a media outlet asks for it, it's generally exempt under Open Records Act until that particular investigation or that particular prosecution, which may take a long time, is over. As a former DA of a pretty large county up in Cobb, you know, I was frequently asked those questions, and sometimes by the very agency that I direct now, the GBI. What do you think? We've got a video. And I would usually say, get it out. Let's get it out and let folks see it. Not everyone says that, and they may have their reasons, but to answer your question, there's appropriate ways to do it. The problem is you may have to wait a while based on the way open records are. But again, with fingers crossed, maybe we're getting better to a point where we're willing to put that stuff out in front of folks and let them see it.
That's interesting that you bring up the Open Records Act, because you're right that the way that it's structured right now affords a great amount of discretion to law enforcement agencies, because of course you can release documents that aren't subject to Open Records Act if you choose to. You're just not required to if the public requests them until potentially years after these incidents happen. If investigations and potential prosecutions take that long, sometimes those decisions on a final prosecution or resolution of the case can take a really long time to make. And so, what's your perspective on, potential reforms in that arena? Should we be giving less discretion to agencies and be putting more objective guidelines in place about when these videos need to be released so that the public can see them?
I think there's probably some ways to reach a point where it can be disclosed quicker. The truth is, when we get called, and I give you, again, another hands-on example, when we get called to, say, an officer-involved shooting, and we begin accumulating all of the video and surveillance and body cams and everything that we can actually begin looking at with our eyes, what we want to do is we want to get to a point as expeditiously as possible where we say, these are the folks that we need to go sit down with now. We need to go interview this person, this officer, this potential witness based on what we've seen on this video. The truth is, Sarah, that I wouldn't feel comfortable with that getting out until that step is done, because what we don't want to see happen is that, and I just use this metaphorically, you see the video and you change what you think you saw based on what the video shows. And we don't want that to happen. But I do think that you're absolutely correct. It's not good for us to wait until either an investigation is completed or certainly a prosecution is completed, because those take a long, long time. Our goal, if we do an officer-involved shooting, our goal is to have it on a prosecutor's desk in 90 days. We're pretty doggone good at that. We're 90, 92, 93% of the time, we'll have that entire officer-involved investigation wrapped up to a prosecutor within 90 days. As you and I both know, there's some prosecutors that it'll never see the light of day. Not only will you never see the video, there'll never be a decision made on it. And so that's not healthy. It's not the way this thing ought to work. So there needs to be some middle ground there, some way that we can look at when it reaches this point, then it needs to be out there. And again, and it may sound a little odd coming from where I see it, but from my perspective, the earlier we do that, in the end, we're much better off, because I cannot tell you the number of times I've had people come up to me and say, I don't particularly like you, I don't particularly agree with you, but I appreciate you letting us see that. I appreciate you letting us get out in front of it. And so I just think in the end that benefits not only us, but it benefits our citizenry. And in the end, that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Gerry, I have a question for you, which is turning back more to a citizen's perspective. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about the City of Atlanta's right to record policy, and maybe how that contrasts with some of the other standards that you see around the state, and do other agencies and police departments have similar policies, or is that something that the rest of them should be striving to? What's your perspective on that?
Well, and I think that list of cases is illustrative of the problem across the state, because most departments, and by most I mean 99% of departments, county and city, do not have a right to record policy in their standard operating procedures. And what that means is that the officers are guessing, often untrained, and don't know what to do. And so they end up making lots of mistakes where they will arrest people for recording, especially if it's in a situation where they don't want to be recorded. And a recent case that I did in Fort Valley, my client was just roaming through the city. He was a blogger, and he was videotaping some public buildings. And because of how he looked, they decided he was, quote, a suspicious person. And they ultimately arrested him when he was filming for being a suspicious person claiming a loitering ordinance. And what they were really doing was arresting him for filming. And had they been trained, and as the result of that lawsuit, they got the training, they would have known that citizens have the right to film in public places. They just do. I think it would really be wonderful if there was, if every county, every city, their law enforcement had these policies, because it would clarify things and it would ensure transparency and accountability of police, or at least be a step towards that.
And Gerry, do you know, just for reference, how widespread body cam use is around Georgia these days? My understanding is pretty much universal, but
it's becoming pretty widespread, and sometimes it's a budgetary question for departments, but it's becoming more and more widespread. And I would say, as long as we're talking about policies, what we are seeing in a lot of excessive force police misconduct litigation is that even the officers who have body cams, sometimes they're not turned on, sometimes suddenly the power fails, sometimes they are turned off at pregnant places in an event. Having policies for departments that tell officers when you must turn on your camera, when you must charge it, and that you cannot kind of flip it off just because you don't want something to be seen, would be really critical. We see it so often in litigation where we may get part of a body cam image or none at all. The officers have those claims. I forgot to turn it on. I accidentally turned it off. The power went out, all those kinds of issues.
I want to talk a little bit about dispersal orders, because I think that's a really common way that police interacting with people exercising First Amendment rights, starts to people get confused about what they have to comply with and things like that. Zoe, just from your perspective, have you, when you've been involved in protests, have you experienced a lot of dispersal orders? Like, what kind of do those situations? What do those look like when you're involved in them?
The ones that I've been to where I've heard the dispersal orders, well, it was a few in Louisville and one here in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. They were actually, well, all of them were peaceful. I mean, of course, you do have agitators that are usually there, but people are like, okay, you can't do that, you can't do this, and we're usually able to calm down the crowd when it gets too, I guess, heated in a way. So the one in Atlanta I went to a couple weeks ago, they did the dispersal thing once, maybe twice at most, and then they released tear gas. Even though, like I said, the protest was extremely peaceful, maybe 100 to 200 people there, not a lot of people. One guy, one police officer at the Capitol, he started to shoot his pellet gun across the street. So that's, but luckily there were a lot of journalists there who were recording, and usually we have legal observers when we do things like that, who go around, record, and ask you for your name and your birthday so we can find you later in whatever jail system that you're in. But that's pretty much it. In each state, well, Kentucky and Georgia, they kind of do stuff similarly. Like, yeah, it's usually similar. They say it once, twice, maybe, and then release tear gas. Or you have cops in full riot gear with billy clubs running at you.
Claire, I know you advised that folks, comply with dispersal orders unless they have an express agreement with police departments that they're not subject to them, which some news organizations do have up front with police departments. But so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, assuming that everybody complies with them in the moment, but what would you look for to understand if a dispersal order is violative of the First Amendment versus justified in the circumstances?
Sure. Well, One of the key aspects is that it needs to be clearly communicated to everyone at the scene, which usually means more than announcing it once or twice if it's a crowd situation. So dispersal orders have to be given audibly, and there has to be a clear path for dispersing, and then there has to be an opportunity for people to actually get themselves together and disperse. And oftentimes what happens is 1 or 2 orders are given, not everybody could hear them, it wasn't clear where they were supposed to disperse to, and then people start being arrested. And that's really not how dispersal orders are supposed to be executed. That being said, you know, as I mentioned earlier, if you hear it, you should still go ahead and comply, even if you think it hasn't really been effectively communicated to everyone on the scene. But a lot of the post-arrest challenges often relate to the fact that, you know, there weren't megaphones being used to give the order. Maybe there was a lot of noise, ambient noise or other noise that kept people from hearing it. They didn't know where to go. Sometimes you have situations where the ways to disperse are actually blocked by police, and people can't get out. So those are some of the things to look for in terms of assessing, was this a constitutionally sound order to disperse?
Great. Well, we have quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to start going through those now if you guys are all right with that, to make sure we have enough time. The first one that I'm seeing here is, what's the legality of officers editing body cam footage that they have provided to journalists? Gerry, that might be something that you have thoughts on.
Sure, as long as the journalist has framed their request in a way that it would cover all of the body cam footage for that event, they cannot edit the body cam footage and give the reporter a smaller version of the event. And the important thing, though, is when you're requesting the video, to make sure that you just ask for the video over a very long time period, give the time frame if you know it, or just say all the video that day. And then you can look at it and you can edit it down. But they cannot edit it unless you give them the opportunity to, by not carefully framing your request.
Our next question is whether a journalist can legally photograph or take video of demonstrations when a curfew is in effect. So I assume in this question that the journalist would be violating the curfew, or at least there is a curfew subject or applicable to other people that they are filming or taking video of. Claire, do you have a take on that?
Well, many curfew orders expressly carve out members of the press and exempt them from the curfew. If the curfew does not do that, journalists, again, would be subject to it unless they have some side agreement with law enforcement. But the failure to carve out journalists could be a basis to challenge the curfew order as infringing the First Amendment.
Yeah, and I would add that sometimes the curfew orders won't specifically carve out journalists, but they will carve out persons who are engaged in their employment at that time. And sometimes that can be expanded to obviously cover a reporter who's engaged in their job film.
The next one I'm saying is, what constraints apply when recording on private property versus public property? So inside a store versus a sidewalk or a government building.
Well, on private property, the owner of the property determines whether or not you can film. You're allowed to stand on the sidewalk and film what you can see just from being in a public space. But if you're actually, in the store or on someone's land, they get to determine whether or not you can film. And if they ask you to stop, you should stop.
I have a good Fourth Amendment question here. If you have your camera in a bag that has a lock, and unless the police have reasonable suspicion that you have an illegal substance in your locked bag, they can't access it without a warrant. Is that correct? I think reasonable suspicion of any criminal activity within your bag would count, not just the illegal substance. But Claire, I don't know if you have a take on that. It seems pretty situationally specific to me, whether a lock is going to do anything on your bag or not. But
so the First Amendment is my area, not Fourth, but
okay.
I think,
Gerry, then,
and
maybe.
Gerry, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think if it's incident to an arrest and the bag is, on your person, that they may be able to require you to let them look. But the lock, I think, makes it questionable if they could force you to unlock it. So I'm going to see what Gerry thinks about that.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that they're going to be able to force you to unlock it. I think that will require, even if it's incident to arrest, that the officer's going to have to get a warrant to unlock it. But Director Reynolds may have some insight too.
We would get a search warrant. I can't speak for every department, Sarah, but in that circumstance, I'd be very disappointed if we didn't go secure a search warrant. That's what we would do for the bag. Good.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. In terms of where the body cams, which agencies have them, which don't, we have a question here about whether Georgia troopers have them. I believe they don't. Does anybody know if that is the case? And then is DPS or State Patrol moving toward body cam? You might know a little bit more about that, Director Reynolds, if you have.
Interestingly enough, the DPS has a new commissioner. The governor just named Chris Wright, a really fine fella. He'll be running that department now. And so I don't know if Colonel Wright's plans are in the future will be to get body cams. I think anytime you're in a situation a little bit different from what the GBI is, but when you're a first responder and you're engaging citizenry in traffic stops or anything of that nature, it's always best to have them. So whether or not they will or not, I think that's a agency issue for them to decide in the future.
I think that answers one of these other questions, which is yes, the use of body and in-car cameras is at the discretion of individual agencies. At least body cams are, and I assume the same case for dash cams on cars would be up to each individual agency if they want to use those. Is that right?
Yeah, but Gerry he probably knows more about this than I do, but I don't know of very few departments now that don't have at least what we call the dash cam videos. Again, I haven't looked, but in our dealings with the folks that we deal with, the majority of the time, even if it's a budgetary issue on body cams, the dash cams have been around so long that we usually see those.
I'd agree with that. I mean, we are on the trajectory of more and more departments having body cams. We're on the right trajectory, but it could also be expedited through legislation, either federal or state, to make it happen, to make it funded, and to have some standards to ensure that the body cams are uniformly utilized when they actually have them.
This is not a question from the chat, but I had it on a list of potential things that might come up. And so I'd like to pose it to the group, which is, what are the guidelines for interactions with police? A lot of these situations can get tense. I have seen videos of protests this summer of insults being hurled at police. The second video we watched had some choice language in it directed at officers. And so what does the First Amendment have to say about the things that you are saying to police in a protest situation?
I'll just jump in because I have a lot of these cases. Citizens have the right to say things that may insult the police officer. They just do. And the officer is duty bound not to react to that. Officers are expected to have thick skin. And when they fail to do that by arresting somebody or using force against somebody who talks bad about them, they're facing a lawsuit if they do that. I mean, just very simply. I have just a recent case. I had someone who was riding their bike by an officer arresting two people, and she yelled "F the police," and they arrested her. They left the people that they were arresting and went and arrested her, and we ended up settling that case for $100,000. They just can't do that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Sarah. The reality is, the police have to have a thick skin. I mean, the First Amendment covers that. It doesn't cover people being complete categorical horses' asses, and and that happens all the time, and it will, it happens more and more now than when I was a uniform cop years ago. But those guys they're just it's sad, but they just have got a thick skin and deal with it.
And Gerry, one last question for you. I was wondering if you could sort of talk about the gray area involved in being in close proximity to an arrest. And I know that the second video we watched is pretty illustrative of, an example that you thought was good. She was not interfering with the arrest, but if you could talk about, how ambiguous it is in the law regarding, if you are interfering or not interfering, and the subjectivity of that.
I mean, I think that there's definitely some vagaries, and as I advise clients, I try to get a feel for how wary they are of being arrested. If they're really fearful of being arrested, if they really don't want to be arrested, then they need to steer farther clear. Others that I represent are they don't want to be arrested, but they also want to do their observational role, and they may get closer to the officer. And the law doesn't give some defined limit. It's very fact specific and contextual. But I think the basic rules are you can't get between the arrestee and the officer. That's going to be real problems for you. And then, there's some periphery where if the officer's telling you to move back and you're within, a couple arms distance, I'd probably move back a little bit. But if you're farther than that, you don't have to go across the street. I mean, I've had the officer tell people to move across the street, and then the image becomes degraded a bit from that distance, and I tell them you shouldn't do that. So, but a lot of it's personal risk aversion to getting arrested.
I think that's all the questions I see. But Zoe, did you want to jump in on the topic that we had talked about before that last one about insults being thrown at officers and those sorts of interactions? Do you have any input there?
Yeah, I just when it comes to, I guess, First Amendment, being able to say what I want to say, and interactions with police, I think that, of course, lack of accountability and transparency when it comes to police officers has been deep-rooted in this country for years, especially when you think about the foundation and how policing started in my community. So we have that because, my generation doesn't really trust police officers. The generation above me, my parents don't really trust police officers, and so on and so forth. But I've had, so when you have that kind of distrust kind of in our veins of not trusting police officers, of course, when we have interactions with them, it's kind of like fight or flight in a way, especially because I've had so many. I think almost every one of my family members has had some type of incident when it comes to police brutality or police harassment. Just a couple days ago, my cousin was at a traffic stop, and the cop was signaling weird or something like that, and she yelled out, "This is stupid," and he got in his car and chased her down and followed her to a gas station and was harassing her. And she has the whole thing on video, thankfully, using video. Or even when I got arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, I was on Daniel Cameron's front lawn a couple months ago. I knew I was getting arrested because technically that's trespassing. But even when we were in the back of the van getting to the jail, when we were quiet, they would drive nice. But when we were chanting or, saying something, I felt like I was about to break my neck, because they were driving so wild and so erratically. Like I was literally scared for my life as we were driving to that jail. So I would hope, and I, having this conversation when it comes to law enforcement, if we just have a conversation and just be very transparent about the history of policing in our community, I think we could go really, really far in the future of policing in our community. So I just wanted to, add that in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It looks like we are out of time. So thank you so much to everyone who attended today. Thank you for our panelists, to donating their time, and thanks to our sponsors, especially CNN and Kilpatrick Townsend, for making this event possible. I also want to remind everybody that next week, the Georgia First Amendment Foundation is holding our annual Weltner Freedom of Information celebration on Thursday at 1 p.m. If you want to see Zoe get a First Amendment Hero Award, please do attend. And we have some other great programming involved. So the registration link will be shared in the chat, and it also appears on the slide on the screen. And if you haven't already registered, we would love to see you there. Thank you again so much, everybody, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.